What tools and timelines will matter for the Pacers this summer as so many moving parts come in for a team that could run it back? What will matter for their finances? What tools will they have? What dates will matter as they try to build their team out? We'll break it all down today on the Locked On Pacers podcast.
You are Locked On Pacers, your daily Indiana Pacers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What up, y'all? Happy Friday. Congrats. You made it through the week and the month, and welcome into another edition of the Locked On Pacers podcast, where we, of course, talk about the Indiana Pacers. As always, my name's Tony East. I cover the team for Forbes and SI, and today, a lot to get to as we continue to look ahead at the Pacers offseason. Went through some of your comments, went through some of the stuff I thought was important, and we're going to break down the how of the Pacers' improvement. Yesterday, we looked at their internal players, the considerations the team will have to make, the monies, the contract comps. Today, we'll look more at the tools to do it and the dates and all that jazzy jazz and get into some of the specifics and the terminology you'll need to know, mostly because I'll be saying these like 100 times in the next month, but also because you should know them as a fan of the team so you can properly assess what does and doesn't make sense in the summer. Again, this is where I think this stuff is important. It might sound like we're reading out of a dictionary sometimes today, but I promise you'll need to know this stuff to know how the Pacers can get better this summer. Also, I forgot a player yesterday who's going to matter this summer. The date where it will matter is after most of the offseason dust has settled, so I just missed it because I'm stupid, but we'll get to that today. Also, but let's start with the Pacers' financial situation and outlook, because I think that's probably the most interesting and revealing thing when it comes to the Pacers summer. So the most common question I get is, how much cap space do the Pacers have? Because that is the generic, what can they add players? How much, blah, blah, blah. The answer is none. The answer is just straight up zero. And that might seem confusing on how they can re-sign or sign or get players when they have no cap space. And we'll get to that in a second. But let's get into the meat and potatoes of why, right? Because if you just take a glance at their salary cap sheet, you'd say they only have 11 players under contract right now. I'm gonna read all the names. So sorry for that, but it's relevant to the exercise. Tyrese, Haliburton, Myles Turner, Aaron Nesmith, TJ McConnell, Bennedict, Mathurin, Jarris Walker, Jalen Smith, if he opts in, Isaiah Jackson, Ben Shepherd, Andrew Nembhard, and Kendall Brown. That's 11 players for the Pacers who have a contract for next season. Smith could not. McConnell's could be smaller, although it'd be dumb. Brown's could be gone, but that is the 11 right now. Those 11 players, their salaries sum up to $112.846 million if they're all fully guaranteed. It doesn't sound like much. That's only 11 players. The salary cap, as of right now, let me be clear about something that's going to come up a lot in this episode, is projected, not set yet, not set in the conference finals, but went 9 total games out of a possible 14. So there's a lot that could be up in the air still. Projected right now to be $141 million. So how do the Pacers have no cap space if they're 11 under contract players, totals $112.8 million, but the salary cap is much higher than that? That's because of something called cap holds. So I'll explain why those are important. But what those are is they are a charge against the salary cap for a free agent. So Pascal Siakam has a charge against the cap, even though he does not have a contract. Same with Doug McDermott, Obi Toppin, James Johnson, etc. And that number allows you to keep a player's free agent rights. So you hear a lot of talk about Pascal Siakam's bird rights. That allows the Pacers to sign him, even if they're over the cap, to a max contract bigger than any other team. They are allowed to do that if they have his cap hold. If they get rid of his cap hold, and you can do that at any time for any free agent, then they would open up cap space, but they would not be able to sign Pascal Siakam to as big of a contract, which is all relevant because right now they can sign Siakam to a 5-year deal worth $245 million. It starts at $42 million. But if they got rid of all their cap holds, as you can see by the math earlier, they would only have like $27 million in cap space. So they actually can offer him more by keeping his cap hold on their salary books, which is why the cap hold counts against the cap. And his cap hold is huge. It's $56 million. That alone takes them over the salary cap in terms of actual charges. It's not just your salaries that count against the cap. Doug McDermott's cap hold's pretty big because his salary was big last year. That will probably be eliminated because there's no real point of that. I mean, they'll keep his bird rights, but his salary will be less than his cap hold. Obi Toppin has a fairly big cap hold because he was a high draft pick, right? So those cap holds are what take the Pacers over the salary cap. So if you want the Pacers to sign a player who's worth more than probably going to be worth more than, I'll make up a number, but let's say $18 million. Somewhere between $15 and $18 million, just above the MLE. If you want the Pacers to sign a player worth that much money this summer, the only way it's possible is if the Pacers do not keep Siakam or Toppin or McDermott on their team, unless those players sign for the minimum or an exception, which is not happening in the case of Siakam and maybe Toppin. We'll get to him in a second. So that's not worth it. So they're going to try to keep Siakam. All the reporting suggests that there's mutual interest and that they're going to offer him the max, and that's great. So that means they're over the cap. And if they sign Siakam to a max, add in 40-something million to that salary total we talked about earlier, and they're over the salary cap. So the Pacers have no cap space this summer. There's no way they can just go sign a free agent with cap space. They can still sign players, and we'll get to the how in a second, but that's an important place to start. It's either Siakam or worse players. That's why it's so critical that they bring him back. Over the cap teams can, of course, re-sign their own players. They can sign Toppin and Siakam and even McDermott. Legally, they won't. Up to a max contract, right? But they can add external players too. Teams that are over the cap are given a couple resources to actually improve their team. And they are called the mid-level exceptions, or in the case of over the cap teams, the biannual exception is also an exception they get to add talent to their squad. So what those are is if you're over the cap, you are allowed to use these exceptions. There's one called the taxpayer mid-level exception, which is smaller and intended for teams that are paying the tax or close to it. And there's the non-taxpayer mid-level exception, which is bigger and for teams farther from the tax but over the cap. But using the non-taxpayer one hard caps you. Not going to get into that today. So there are pros and cons to both. Obviously, signing a better player using more money is better. As of right now, again, this is projected because this is based on where the salary cap comes in. The non-taxpayer mid-level exception projects to start next season at $12.85 million. That's pretty big. That's a pretty big first-year salary for a player, whereas the taxpayer mid-level is smaller. It's only $5.1 million. So you can offer a 4-year deal with the non-taxpayer and a 3-year deal with the taxpayer. So I think it's about 4 years, $55 million would be the full boat of a non-taxpayer mid-level exception offer. The Pacers can offer that to a free agent, even if they're over the cap, right? So think of a player at about that level. That's what they could add. We'll get to why I don't think they will, but we'll get to, but that is something that is available to them, right, as an option. And then the taxpayer mid-level exception, if they'd prefer to use that instead to not be hard capped or to limit their own spending or because the tax is a concern, which we'll get to in a second as well, that can only be up to a 3-year deal. And that starts at that 5.1 million number. So that's something like 3 years, something between 16 and 17 million. My on the napkin math is not very good right now. But those are the two, one or the other. You cannot use both of those exceptions, but those would be a tool that the Pacers could have to add a player who is not currently on their team while still over the cap, right? But they can't go higher than that while over the cap. So it's Siakam plus a mid-level exception player, or Siakam and Toppin and a mid-level exception player, or some combination of those and all those guys. Who knows? But those are the other tools. There's one more called the biannual exception, which is a really interesting one that I think there's some kind of game theory involved here. It is a deal that starts at a maximum value of $4.68 million and can be up to 2 years in length. Here's what makes the biannual exception so interesting. You cannot use it 2 years in a row. So if the Pacers use it this year, they can't use it next year. If they don't use it this year, they can use it next year, which is a fascinating game to play. Since the Pacers are now entering an environment where they will be over the cap probably every year for a bit going forward, they can think about when the best time to use it is. I would wager that they don't use it this summer because they could use other exceptions to add players and then use that one in the future. And since the BAE fits into the taxpayer mid-level exception, you can agree to terms with the player and then figure out which exception they fit in based on how the rest of your summer goes. So I predict, given their tax, not concern, but how close they could be to it, they will not use the BAE, but that's another tool available to them. And you can always sign players to minimum contracts no matter what. They'll have these, assuming they make a picks in the second round, they'll have the second round pick exception to sign those players to contracts. So between the mid-levels and the BAE and the draft, there are ways for them to add players to their current team, even while they're over the cap. So to summarize what we've talked about in layman's terms for the last 8-9 minutes, they do not have cap space. They cannot just go sign a name max free agent player. Paul George is going to be the name everybody says, whatever. They can't just go sign Paul George unless Paul George is taking like a $10 million per year deal, which is comical to even discuss. They can't just go get him. or James Harden, or I name any other, marquee free agent. But they can keep their own guys on any deal. They can use the mid-level exception, whichever one they decide to use. They can use the BAE if they want, and they can sign guys to minimum contracts, and they can sign their draft picks. So that is the financial reality for the Pacers. Now, there's other stuff that matters, including the tax and the key dates and some other players I didn't talk about yesterday. So let's talk about all that as we continue on the resources and timing episode of the offseason for the Pacers. Before we do that, though, let's very quickly talk about Prize Picks, America's #1 fantasy sports app, where it's simple to play. You pick more than or less than on 2 or more player stat projections and watch the winnings roll in. The biggest moments in basketball are here. The NBA Finals are coming up. Get in on the playoff action, win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks as you and the world's best players take the game to a new level during the postseason. You can now up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks. With as little as 4 correct picks, you can turn $10 into 1,000. Basketball and hockey entries today on Prize Picks, America's #1 fantasy sports app. It's simple to play. They offer injury insurance, and you can make your picks and submit your entry in like a minute or less. Plus, quick withdrawals, easy gameplay, and an enormous selection of players and stat types are why Prize Picks is so popular. For example, Caitlin Clark, still playing for the Fever, more than or less than 30 points. Luka Doncic, more than or less than 8.5 rebounds. Stuff like that. You just pick more than or less than on 2 or more player stat projections. Watch those winnings roll in. Download the app today. Use the code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100 on Prize Picks. Again, download the app today. Use the code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100 at Prize Picks. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy. We are back here on Locked On Pacers. Thanks for making us your first listen today and every single day. For your second listen, Locked On Mavs. The Mavs are going to the finals. Wow. What a run for them. They're defending their tails off in the postseason, and they will play the Celtics, who just vanquished the Pacers. Mavs-Celtics starts June 6th. 6 days of no NBA hoops. But Locked On Mavs can tell you about how the Mavs won Game 5 in Minnesota. Check it out. And then go to Locked On Wolves and hear about the other side of that and the upcoming offseason in Minnesota. Here, we're talking about the offseason in Indiana, where we just ran through how the Pacers can add talent from a resource perspective. That obviously does not include trades. They can make trades anytime. Just looking at signings and free agency, any legal trade is possible in theory at any time. Let's talk about some other numbers that matter, or numbers that I will be throwing around this offseason. Currently, the projection for the luxury tax, I can't believe I'm talking about the tax, next season is $171.345 million. Again, that could change depending on where stuff comes in. So this number might actually matter for the Pacers this summer, which is why I asked Chad Buchanan about the team's appetite for potentially paying the tax this summer. And of course, again, it all depends on what's available or what it is. He said, talked about Herb Simon, and then he said, wants to see nothing more than to bring a championship. And I think if we get to the point where we feel like if this is a move that could get us into a championship spot, I think ownership will get behind it. So not ruled out. If you heard me rant on this already this offseason, there actually is value in waiting till the right time to pay the tax, although in theory, a team paying it every year would be the best thing ever, but teams don't do that unless you're the Warriors or the Clippers. Anyway, the luxury tax line is $171.34 million. Let me go through an exercise with you to explain why that number matters and is interesting to me. Okay, as we went through the finances of every player. So I'm going to make some assumptions really quick, and this is not all correct. Likely different things will happen. Okay, assumption 1, TJ McConnell, his full contract becomes guaranteed. Assumption 2, Jalen Smith opts into his contract. That one really could go either way. Assumption 3, Pascal Siakam signs his max contract. And assumption 4, the Pacers okay, there's a couple more. I'm not going to number all the assumptions. Another one is James Johnson just re-signs at his minimum. Obi Toppin signs a 3-year, $41.6 million deal. I'll explain why I get to that in a second. And then Doug McDermott on a 1-year, $4 million contract. You might think that's an overpay. We'll get to, again, none of this specifics matter yet. I just want to explain that. All that stuff sounds reasonable to me, right? I don't think they're going to waive McConnell. There's no way. He's totally worth his deal. Jalen Smith could opt in. That seems reasonable to me after the postseason you had. Siakam on the max seems like the most likely outcome of that to me. That starts at $42.3 million. Toppin on that deal, what that contract I made up just now is 3 years, $41.66 million. is a 3-year deal while his first-year value starts at the exact value of the mid-level exception, which is what other teams could theoretically offer him. Maybe he wants a little more from the Pacers, but that would open up the most trade options for him if that needs to be a thing this season. It would still seem like a fair deal to me if you listen to my contract comps yesterday. That is just a made up a little bit number, but that's just for the sake of exercise. James Johnson on the minimum, you get that. Doug McDermott at $4 million. I just picked like Kevin Love, Seth Curry range from last year, but you could argue Doug McDermott's a minimum player. Either way, those just picture all those contracts. All seem very realistic choices for the Pacers. That would make their 15-man roster the exact same one as last season, and there is a little bit of a hurdle there with their draft. We'll get to that in a second, but I'm sorry for all the lead up. That is a 15-player roster. It's done. That team is in the tax. That team I just described to you has $174 million in player salaries, plus the dead money of Nick Stauskas, Juwan Morgan, and Malik Fitz on the books. And that is a team with $175 million in taxable salaries, including all of that stuff, which means actually it's closer to 176. They would be $4.5 million over the tax. So all of that stuff happening, yeah, it's possible. Pacers could decide to just pay that tax. But if you're that close to the tax, every team in NBA history has tried to get under if they can at some point. And so if you can avoid it in the offseason, great, you should. So that makes me think that path with all reasonable contracts for their returning players seems like one or two things would not happen, right? That's why the luxury tax line matters and why the $171.34 million matters. The Pacers would like, when the official numbers come in from the NBA, the actual number to be higher than the estimation, because then they have more wiggle room to maneuver through all this. They can make different decisions and all that. So we will know that number from the league during or right before the moratorium ahead of free agency. But the tax does matter to me, right? Again, in fantasy land where it's all fake money and all that, in theory, yes, the best case scenario is Herb Simon pays it every year and no one ever cares. There is a penalty for paying the tax a certain number of times across a certain number of years called the repeater tax penalty. And that is why it matters the first year you start the repeater clock. And so if a team is not viewing itself as a contender, it actually does make sense for a team that is willing to pay the tax for a contender to wait for the right time, because it still adds flexibility on a contending timeline. But again, fans should not care and should think their team should spend as much as possible. So if you think the Pacers are championship contender right now, you should not care about anything I just said. You should say, yep, they should sign all those players to those deals and make the tax. If you think the Pacers should be patient, or if you think the history of them never, very rarely, it was a long time ago, spending into the tax, then you would imagine that what I just described could be changed slightly. So, like the obvious one that I think everyone will say first, Doug McDermott at $4 million. Just get rid of that, right? Get rid of it. Okay, understood. Replace that with their 36th pick on a minimum deal or a near minimum deal, and you save $2 million there. And then you just waive Kendall Brown, you save another $2 million, and you're really close, right? You're still a little bit over, but you're close. You could figure the rest of that later. Maybe you could stretch something. I have no idea. I don't think there's anything to stretch. But you know, that there are ways to get it closer, but still over. Maybe it's Pascal Siakam is slightly less than the max, like $40 million. That would help them in savings. Maybe Jalen Smith opts out. That would help the Pacers. That's $5.4 million, but they might want him back. He's good and young and played all season for them and was a key part of their best defensive and rebounding stretch of the regular season. Maybe it's Toppin at a lower number, right? Who knows? There's a lot of ways to keep it lower, but everything I just said about hypothetical contracts seems like a reasonable outcome to me for the player I mentioned, and yet it does not seem like a realistic reality for the Pacers because it puts them into the tax. So I think there's a lot up in the air there. I think the 36th pick being a player who would get a standard contract is an interesting factor if they actually make that pick. There's just a lot of fascinating factors to me. So one takeaway you could have there is every contract you expect from a Pacers free agent, maybe knock it down a peg if you think they're all going to be back. Thing two is maybe they trade pick 36 for just a future pick and add no salary. Thing three is maybe they start the season with 14 players. Thing four is that there could be trades coming this summer. Or thing five is that something zany and a combination of all that stuff happens. But that is why the luxury tax number matters. Now, there's another number that could matter, and that's the apron. Can you believe it? The first apron. You get to hear about these for the first time because the Pacers didn't have to care about these last year. This is a new CBA thing. The first apron current projection for next season is $178.655 million. That's the hard cap number. That's where some transactional restrictions come into play. Certainly, if you're barely over the tax, you want to be under the first apron and not deal with all that. So that is an even harder line. However, all those numbers I just said combined would be under the first apron. So as it stands, I think it's going to be fascinating to monitor that tax line. I think that's another number that matters. I think the guaranteed salary number matters. And there's still so much more to get to for this Pacers offseason. But I hope you understand the numbers that are pushing and pulling on them, the resources they have to add talent, what it will all take. And if I've missed anything, comment, tweet at me, let me know. Because I did miss something yesterday, and that's why it's very valuable to have all of you listening. And we're going to get to one of those things I missed yesterday, but I'm on Twitter at Tony R. Reese, and if you're watching on YouTube, comment below. There's still more coming here. I want to talk about Isaiah Jackson, some two-way players, and plenty more notes about the dates that matter this offseason. Let's get to it. Back here on Locked On Pacers, thanks for making us your first listen today and every single day. For your second listen, check out Locked On NBA to hear the latest and greatest about Wolves, Mavs, and from around the association. And you get to hear me on there. Me and Wes Goldberg chopped it up about Game 5 of Wolves, Mavs, looked ahead at the Wolves offseason, and talked about the most crucial players in the finals series. My pick, spoiler alert, was Kyrie Irving, but you can hear Wes's and much more on that podcast. Let's keep going on the Pacers here. The biggest thing I missed yesterday when running through all the Pacers free agents and extension things is that Isaiah Jackson is extension eligible, as are all 2021 draftees this summer in the first round via their rookie scale extensions like the one Tyrese Haliburton and Aaron Nesmith signed last summer. That can be up to the max. It won't be, but it can be up to the max, up to 5 years in length, although 4 years for most guys, with 8% raises. So up to a huge number. What is Isaiah Jackson worth? Who knows? The deadline for that is 2 days before the regular season actually starts. Last year, I think the best comp would be like Paul Reed. Paul Reed probably a little better than Isaiah Jackson, but cap inflation, all that. Paul Reed got 3 years, $23.5 million on a really funky contract last summer. Maybe something like that. But I don't know why Isaiah Jackson would consider extending unless Jalen Smith is gone or like he knows he has a guaranteed role with this team for lots of time. It's just very rare that extensions at that low of a value happen for rookies. Paul Reed got his via restricted free agency. Nasir Little and Peyton Pritchard kind of ruined my argument against never players taking those smaller rookie scale extensions, but it's possible, and we'll talk more about it when the time has come relevant for it, but that is something I missed yesterday. We didn't talk about the two-way guys at all. Oscar Tshiebwe, Quentin Jackson, Isaiah Wong. Oscar Tshiebwe, G League Rookie of the Year, had a wonderful season. And to be clear, all of their two-way guys will be restricted free agents if the Pacers present them a qualifying offer. If maybe rank the likelihood those guys would be back, I would say Tshiebwe 1, Jackson 2, Wong 3. Again, Tshiebwe had a solid year. Who knows if he's ready for NBA minutes yet? He's got a lot to work on, but clearly has an insanely good rebounding skill. Quentin Jackson fit in really well with this team, was great in the G League, is a good scorer. Isaiah Wong didn't grow as a point guard to me. I don't know the Pacers' assessment of him, but is a quality scorer, stuck around for the whole season for a reason. But maybe they want to cycle in someone else, and maybe they want to keep him. Who knows? But they also have those 2 late second rounders. That means they could add someone else on a two-way. So that's why I would rank those guys in that order of chances to keep them. They kept Kendall Brown last year on a two-way and added 2 new guys. So they have kept two-way guys before. We'll see what happens there. Now I've covered every free agent, the Pacers' salary situation, how they can add players, the resources to do so, why I think a lot of random numbers will matter that I'll bring up a lot. There's one more thing to get to, and that's the key dates. You know what's really funny is the Key Dates podcast in prior seasons have been all 3 segments podcast, because there's the draft combine and the draft and the G League camp and the playoffs and the finals and all this stuff that the Pacers need to look forward to that matters for their season and contract deadlines and all that stuff. Well, they made it to the conference finals. They passed a lot of that stuff already. So it's way shorter this time, and I can fit it in at the end of an episode, but it all still matters. The order of operations, if you don't know, in the NBA is very important, and we should talk about it right now. So the next date is the opt-out date for overseas players in the draft. That's later in June. As it pertains to the Pacers specifically, the most important next date is 1 day after the finals ends, which is whatever date or game that actually happens in. So if it's a sweep and it's game 4, The very next day is when this applies. This is new in the new CBA. Teams can negotiate with their own players. Let me put some air quotes up. Teams can officially negotiate with their own players one day after the finals. Nothing nefarious ever goes on in the NBA. There's nothing ever before that. But that is the official date now, which is different because, like, in theory, I think it's possible the day after the finals, you see leaks that are like, X player has agreed to X deal with X team. And like that could come out earlier now. So that's why that date's going to matter. You're not just going to see all the free agency bananas on June 30th. At least I think. We'll see how that actually looks in practice from a reporting and transactional perspective. But for the Pacers, who are a strong run it back team, a lot of their discussion of free agency could be that day, one day after the finals. Later in the summer, June 26th and 27th, that's the NBA draft. You know what that is. That's 2 days, because if you didn't know this, if this is the first time you're hearing this, the NBA draft is stretched out now. It's 2 days. The second round's its own day, and the first round's its own day. So the Pacers might have no involvement on day one if they don't have a first-round pick, and then very early involvement on day two if they make no trades. Their current picks, if you don't know, are 36, 49, and 50. 36 could be a roster player. 49 and 50 seem more likely to be two-way guys. But that's the draft situation. 2 days is very fascinating. I think that's better. It's so chaotic in the second round for executives. And I know people say, woe is me, whatever. But truly, if they have a more stable situation or more time to figure stuff out after the first night, and they can get the right player for their situation, that's better for the player if the player's in the right situation. And that's why I think it's a good thing. It could land more second rounders in favorable or correct situations. So maybe no one's dying to watch the second round on TV, but if it's better for the NBA basketball product and a TV network is willing to buy the rights for the second round of the NBA draft, it's a win for everybody except for people who don't care about the second round. So that's why that's happening. We'll see what the Pacers do there. We'll preview the draft starting next week. And then 6/28. So the draft ends June 27th. June 28th, one day after the draft, that's when TJ McConnell's contract would become fully guaranteed. In theory, that means the Pacers need to waive him 2 days before that. I don't think they're going to waive him anyway. So June 28th is the day that TJ McConnell's $9.3 million contract becomes fully guaranteed for the upcoming season. I talked yesterday about why that's a no-brainer. If you didn't hear that and you want to hear it. The next day, June 29th, Jalen Smith, his player option decision is due by that day. The Pacers probably would like it if they got that decision before the draft to make better decisions about their financial future. Maybe they already know before the draft, but nothing's official by then. But that's the final day Jalen Smith can decide. If you're Jalen Smith, maybe you want to see what the Pacers do in the draft before you make that decision. What if they draft a center? What if they trade away Isaiah Jackson on draft night? There's any number of things that could influence his decision. So the push and pull of that will be fascinating, but that is the official date of Jalen Smith's player option decision being due after the draft, but before now what I'm going to call external free agency starts. Because remember, the internal part that happens earlier can now start right after the finals, which is a no-brainer. Why teams can't negotiate with players on their own team earlier is dumb. They're under contract with that team already. The next date after Jalen Smith's player option, obviously free agency starts on June 30th at like 6 p.m. They can't become official until July 6th is when signings can become official. That includes internal signings. That's after the moratorium ends. That's when the league's finances for the next league year are officially set, which means contract values can be set and all that. We're going to mix in some stuff that's not necessarily related to free agency here. The next date on the calendar that's going to matter is July 10th, not for free agency reason or a contract reason. That is when Team USA camp starts. It might be a couple days before that. That day they play Canada in like a friendly. Tyrese Haliburton playing for Team USA, obviously, in the Olympics. Andrew Nemhard playing for Canada. I think that's the only picture I know of for now. Playing in the Olympics. That'll be very cool. Some games to watch to cover on this podcast. In the summer, of course, we covered the World Cup a lot last year with Haliburton and Tice. So that'll be fun. That's when that all starts, and they play against each other early, which will be pretty cool. But yeah, early July is when that all kicks off, and then late July is when those games get going. That date's coming up. July 12th is the start of Summer League, which isn't really a free agency date. That's when you'll see guys play. But for Kendall Brown, who could be fighting to get his contract guaranteed, perhaps Summer League actually matters for his free agency and the Pacers offseason in general. Summer League ends July 22nd, which is also the day that Andrew Nemhard becomes extension eligible for the Pacers. We broke down what that would look like yesterday. It depends where the cap comes in, where the estimated average salary comes in. Something like 4 years, 76 to 80 million is what the max extension would be there, depending on where some numbers come in. My official prediction is that nothing gets agreed to there, even if that is close to his value right now. We'll see. After that, the next date is July 26th. That's when the Olympics start. It runs through August 11th. I don't know Team USA's official schedule, but during that Olympics, specifically on August 6th, that is when TJ McConnell is officially extension eligible. We ran through that one yesterday. His max extension is 4 years, $58.7 million. Again, he would not get all of that, but that's the most it could possibly be. We ran through the pros and cons of that in some high detail yesterday. I think the date could end up being earlier than that because of how the offseason mapping ends up working. I explained that a little yesterday, but that is that when he officially signed his current contract. So for all intents and purposes, just know that he is extension eligible at some point after free agency starts, but before the season starts. That's what's in theory relevant to this discussion. Then there's a big gap. August is shockingly late for a date to even be on the calendar here. Nothing until after that, 2 days before the season. That would be the extension contract deadline for Isaiah Jackson to get his rookie scale extension done if he wanted to do one with the Pacers. Opening night is when Kendall Brown's contract becomes partially guaranteed at $250,000. The rest does not become guaranteed until the league-wide cut-down date next January. And then the final date would be October 31st, Halloween. That is the deadline for team option decisions on the second-year team option for Ben Shepherd, the third-year team option on Ben Shepherd and Jarris Walker, and the fourth-year team option on Bennedict Mathurin. I'm going to help you right now. Those will all be picked up by whatever team they're on, presumably the Pacers. Those will all be picked up. So that's not even actually something that is interesting, but is a formality that will happen at some point this year. Last year, there was at least like discussion about those. This year, there's not. It's very obvious. That is all the dates. That's all the money stuff I think you need to know. I hope I didn't miss something. If I did, if you think, wow, I've listened to this and I still have a question about this or that, let me know. You can hit me up on Twitter at Tony R. East. That's how somebody reached out and said, hey, you forgot about Isaiah Jackson. I did. Or you can comment down below on YouTube if you have a question there. I read through those comments as well. Thank you guys for listening today and throughout the month. Did an episode every single day in May because the playoffs, except for one, that was the day between the end of the Bucks series and the crossover before the Knicks series. And I feel bad that I missed today. So I'm going to do one more. I'm going to record on May 31st, post it Saturday, and then it will be back to normal schedule for June. So just the normal 5 days a week for the weekdays episodes in the offseason. So tomorrow you'll get another one. Tomorrow is going to be the free agent position that I think will be the least intriguing for fans. So I'll do it by myself. That's point guards. Let's talk about some point guards on the free agent market that the Pacers may have interest in. If you've never heard how I do these free agency previews by position, you'll find out come tomorrow. So hope you guys enjoyed today's show. Hope you had a great week. Hope you had a great May. We'll see you in June talking more free agency for the Pacers. Till then, everybody, have a wonderful day.